Hey there, it's Melissa Brunetti, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Karma podcast.
Hey there, Karma Crew. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Mind Your Own Karma, the Adoption Chronicles. Today, I would like to introduce you to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was born in the 60s in Washington, D.C., and relinquished to social services immediately thereafter. Her first family was Japanese, and she stayed with them as a foster baby for 3.5 months. Her adopted family welcomed her along with their adopted son into the family. The first details told to her parents and then to Elizabeth were that her mother was Greek and so was her father, who was a chauffeur to the Greek ambassador. Her father was older and mother in her 20s at the time of her birth. All her life, Elizabeth felt the Greek connection and the desire to find her birth family. Her mother was the central focus. In 2017, she enrolled in 2 DNA websites, and for a year, all her connections were distant cousins with predominantly foreign names, until she connected with a close relative, possibly a first cousin or nephew. He was in fact her nephew, who had been placed for adoption privately and had had his birth family backstory. This was her awakening as the complicated tale of her trans-continental birth family unfolded. Siblings have been reunited, and the story is one of survival for all of them. Elizabeth shares her story as she sorts out her dual identity and her quest to cope with who she was born as and who she is becoming. Here is my interview with Elizabeth. We are welcoming Elizabeth to the show today. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
So glad you're on the show. I am so excited about this story. I don't normally know a lot. I like to be hearing it as you're telling it. So, but the little bit that I do know sounds very interesting. And I'm sure that some other people will be out there saying me too. So let's just start by telling us what you know about why you were put up for adoption.
Well, I am, as I have discovered the fourth of my birth mother's children, and she was living in Istanbul in Turkey, and she had 3 children. She started at a very young age. She was, well, I'm sure not planned by any stretch. She herself was orphaned at a young age, and her mother put her in an orphanage and then took her out of that orphanage in Istanbul to have her go work as a maid in people's home when she was only 10 and 11 years old. She was, from what I've heard from my older birth sister, very upset that she was taken out because she had schooling at the orphanage.
Wow.
Wanted to stay in school, yet she was forced to work as a maid, give her money back to her mother, who was very poor. And her father had died when she was very young, like 8 or 9 years old. And my grandmother, her mother's new beau or whatever, did not like my mother being there, thought my mother needed to, go out and make money. They were poor to the degree where in Istanbul, they were living in, the Greek and the Armenian slums. And this was in a time when things were very bad there for Greeks and Armenians and Muslims. And so they lived a very impoverished life. Well, my birth mother got pregnant when she was 14, and she was in the hospital, and she met a woman who was next to her who was also delivering children. And she said, well, I have an uncle, and he is Armenian, and he's older, but he's unmarried, and he can marry you. And at the time, that was everything. Give a woman a name, give her a place to go. And she, I guess at the time, thought, well, I won't be on the streets, and I'll have someone to care for me. So this 14-year-old had a baby and went to live with this man. He too was he was not by any means a man of wealth or means. He was poor too. She had this first child, and then he was not the father of, right. And then had 2 more children. By the time she was 19, I think he was extremely abusive. my older sister remembers him doing things like picking her up by her hair and, dragging her over to the oven and threatening to kill her and
Oh my
her a lot. She had the opportunity to escape, and she did. So she left, and she ended up in Ankara, that is the capital of Turkey. And she was working for the Greek ambassador's wife, as the Greek ambassador's wife's sort of like prepare her clothes, clean her, like her maid, but her kind of live-in maid. So she moved there, and she left her children. And my sister ended up in an orphanage, and the other two ended up sort of in the same way, but their stories, of course, at first I had no idea. You always think that when you're adopted, first of all, that you're the youngest, and it happened when your mother was really young. Well, my mother was young, but 25 compared to 14 is
Yeah.
20.
Yeah.
So anyway, at the time in politics, what was happening in our country was in Washington, D.C., JFK, Kennedy wanted a different Greek ambassador, because at the time, and so this Greek ambassador who she was working for in Turkey, and my birth father was the chauffeur to the ambassador.
Oh, wow.
President Kennedy decided that he needed this particular Greek ambassador. So he fired the one that he had. So this was early 1962. And at that time, this new ambassador was coming to Washington, D.C., and he brought along, his staff, of course. So in early February, my mother gets on a ship and comes to Washington, D.C. And then in October, I'm born. And my birth father at the time, I guess they were secretly married. So a twist in this story is that when my birth mother was having that baby in the hospital, and the woman she was sitting next to said, "I have an uncle," that woman was married to the man who was actually the chauffeur to the Greek ambassador. He too was older, and she ends up dying. She had twins that were the same age as my oldest sister, and then another son. So that woman died. That chauffeur ended up being the man who is her husband, ended up being my birth father, who, at least on the good side, I've heard that he was actually a pretty decent man. But, he left his children too and moved to the United States to be the chauffeur, but he was dying. And within 3 months of my birth, he was dead of, I'm not sure exactly what, but I think it had to do with liver cancer. But guess he was a heavy drinker. So I don't think that even like right after I was born, I went right into the foster care system. And why I wasn't adopted immediately, I'm not sure. But I think it has to do with the fact that she didn't speak any English. She was caring for her husband, her secret husband at the time, who was dying. What was she going to do with the baby when she was working in DC? And plus, I think one thing that I've come to terms with that definitely is different from the fantasy you have and the reality that you find out is not every mother wants children.
Yeah.
Not every human being has maternal instinct. She herself was not, did not have a loving family or supportive family to take care of her. She was a survivor.
Yeah.
Surely at 14, you're not planning on having a baby. So there's a lot. My sister still doesn't know who her father is, but he was apparently much older, maybe 60. So let's just say she had been raped many times.
Yeah.
In her life, because then she married the other man, and he was that was not what I would call by any means consensual sex. But I think she just didn't have the capacity to want or care for her children. So I was put up for adoption. I was put into foster care, and for a very brief amount of time while they were sorting out paperwork. My parents knew they were going to get me. Apparently some German couple was supposed to get me, but that didn't work out. So I was in the foster care with Japanese parents in Washington, D.C. And apparently they wanted to adopt me, but weren't allowed to. So then my parents got me in January, and that was a very happy thing for them. It was everything they had ever wanted, but they said I did nothing but cry.
Mm,
Yes, they took me to the doctor. I thought maybe something's wrong with her, but I think it was
yeah.
that separation, and I've read your story, so I'm sure you can relate to, you wonder so much. I wonder about them, like,
Yeah.
what are they like, how sad for me that, I was separated from them, because it's just, sort of that weird identity thing. But that's when I was adopted, and that was how that came to be.
Was your mom a citizen? I mean,
I am a citizen
okay.
of the United States, and how weird that she lived in Washington, D.C. she lived in the United States until 2012. And she married again, I think, 2 more times. So she was able to, though, she got my birth sister and my birth brother. She granted them, she sponsored them so they could become citizens. So they immigrated, even though my sister, who was raised in the orphanage for her entire life, probably only saw my mother once or twice in all that time.
Wow.
But she got my sister over here. And in 1972, she came over, and she had wanted nothing more in her life, my birth sister, than to come to the United States and seek out a life and a career, something better than what she lived as in Istanbul. And my mother kicked her out after 2 or 3 months, because, my mother was done. She did what she was supposed to do. She got her daughter here, and then that was it. She literally locked her out of the house. And
How old was your sister?
20 years old. My sister got pregnant,
Oh boy.
had a baby, and this was all within the first year, and she put that baby up for adoption. She ended up marrying the man that she got pregnant with. And because of that, my nephew, my birth nephew, who is just 10 years younger than me, he was put up for adoption in the DC area, and was adopted into through a private adoption. And when he put his information out on the 23andMe or Ancestry, I can't remember which one we linked on, I think Ancestry, we matched, and I was like, oh my God, this is the closest match I've ever had. So we start to correspond, and he's like, I have my private adoption story. And he sent it to me. And it was like, your birth grandmother came over to DC in 1962 because she was working for, the Greek ambassador. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I realized exactly, what had happened and what unfolded, and that I had other siblings. And so starting from then, the next thing that happened was my brother, who also immigrated to the US, went on 23andMe about 3 months later after I connected, and we connected, and it was half brother. And he immediately contacted me and was like, baby sister, I've always, I thought maybe there was another one. And, there were rumors about you, but I just can't, wait to talk to you. Do you want to talk? Turns out he didn't even know that his sister had had a baby and put that baby up for adoption. But he said, I'm your brother. I'm like, wow, I know. He's like, how do you know? And I said, I spilt the tea, because I just did, I wasn't trying. It was my reality. And he called his sister, and she reunited with her son. And it's been for them
Oh my
a
gosh.
beautiful reconnection. So that was pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And my brother wanted to take me to Greece 3 months after he met me on, we never actually met in person. And at first I said yes, but then because that's where my birth mother is now. But then I couldn't handle it. I just wasn't ready to go on a trip with him, who I didn't really know at all.
Right.
we were very, very different. Our lives, even though he immigrated from Turkey, and had been in the US and was very successful here, he and I were just very, I didn't feel comfortable yet, plus I was completely freaked out and started to really go through, I would call it, some depression and just some crashing, like, oh my gosh, this is more than I can take
Yeah.
at once. Much. But also the reality was, and they were always like, well, that's just how our mother is. She's not gonna, hug you and tell you fun stories. She's not been seeking me, just like she was never really seeking them. So I had to get that through my core
Yeah.
too, because all my life I thought, wow, this woman, every time my birthday comes around, is thinking, oh, my daughter, it's her birthday. She just had another birthday. um, my beloved little baby daughter, but that was never the case.
Did you ever talk to her?
I have never talked to her. I have written her. My son, actually, when he was in Europe, he went to go meet her, with my birth sister, who is kind of an amazing person in terms of how she has overcome circumstances in her life. She was actually taking care of her mother, our birth mother, in the last few years when she was living still in the United States. My birth mother's husband was dying, and so she, for a year, took them in to her home and helped him and helped her, and then got my mother back to Greece, where she is now. She lives outside of Athens, and she's not in great health. But my son went with my birth sister and then met my other birth sister there, who is in Greece, and together they went to meet her, my birth mother.
How'd that go?
So it was very emotional, I think, for my son. But it was just kind of like, meeting this woman who's kind of sitting there and not in great health, and is like, oh yes, yes, oh yes, like, oh, you're so handsome, or that kind of thing. And she asked questions about me, but it's more like, oh, how it's not out of some burning desire to meet me. And I think that's been very hard for my mother to understand, because my
Your
mother,
adoptive mother?
yes,
Yeah.
is like, she supports me so much. She's like, I'm so grateful to this woman for having you.
Yeah.
How in the world can she not want you? Because, how can she not accept you? Because I just want her to know how grateful I am to her for the fact that you were born, kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
but I've come to terms with that. And I think now I could go to Greece and meet her, but on my own, on my own terms. I feel, it's not like some tearful reunion is going to occur and she's just going to reach
Yeah.
out and hug.
It's
So,
hard not to have expectations when you don't know, so you conjure up these things in your mind about what you kind of think from what you do know. And then when reality comes and you're like, you see what really is going on, then those expectations come crashing down. And that's when that, depression kind of sets in. Although like I said, you try not to have expectations, but you can't help but kind of do, you know what I mean?
I think it's about, at least you want to feel, and I don't think she doesn't accept me, she doesn't deny me, but there's no emotion.
Yeah.
And I'm such an emotional person, and I'm the person who always is like, oh, I would totally adopt a baby, and I would love that baby so much. Or I can't imagine actually delivering a baby and having to give it away, especially if I love my son. So having those feelings at first, I think it's hard to accept that your mother is sort of ambivalent.
Yeah. It's kind of like she had to probably close off. I mean, it sounded
Yeah.
like she had a traumatic life to begin with, and then, just compounded with having to give her children up, sounds like, and, over and over. So knowing that story of your birth mother, does that kind of give you some compassion for her and how
Yeah,
she's reacting?
it totally does. I see her as a survivor, a very strong person who was able to get herself out of extreme poverty and depravity in a very tough world. And Istanbul is not what you would call a very large city, but especially for Greeks.
Yeah.
It used to be Greece and now it's not. And um it's funny because when I was born in DC, my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was also in DC, they said, I don't know how a Greek baby was given to non-Greek parents, because Greeks are so focused generally on their culture and their community, and that my mother didn't want me, didn't say I need her to go to a Greek family. Well,
Mm.
that was the last thing on her mind where I was going.
Right.
It was better without her,
Yeah.
as
And even if she did, most likely they're going to give you to who they want anyway. I mean, I've heard that story
yes.
before.
Yeah.
So you can say that, but they're going to do what they want anyways. So let's talk about your adoptive parents. You talked about your mom, and did you have an adoptive father as well, or?
I had just, I mean, the best father a girl could ever have. I was extremely close with my father. He died in 2011. And they were both always supportive of me in terms of being adopted, but I was never made to feel like I was different in any way. It's like you're born this one person and then you're given this identity into this other family, and you're just supposed to acclimate and be that person. And they and I are physically and different in many ways, but more so, I think my father, he is just very accepting and very generous with both his love and attention. And when he died, I told my friends, nobody loves you like your dad loves you. Like I
Mm.
felt so much love from him and support from him, and from my extended family as well, but my father especially. I was very close to him, much more so when I was younger than my mother. We were alike in many ways. He was a mentor to me in many ways,
Mm.
very supportive of women and women in, the workplace, and, the kinds of jobs that he had and the way he supported people. Was very impressionable on me. And it's just the kind of person, like, he'd meet my friends and he'd say, well, and, when I was in college, and he would come and go buy groceries and then take us out to dinner, and he'd say, hi, I'm, George, this is my daughter. I belong to her, and, it's just, and he wanted to know about everybody. He was extremely welcoming individual. So losing him was hard.
What heritage were they?
White bread, English, English, Scottish,
Yeah.
as English and Scottish. And then I think my mother, the same, very similar. Um, extremely sort of like, my grandfather was a general in the army. My grandmother, this is my father's parents, was college educated at Vassar, in the early 20s. They were a
Wow.
very sort of, call it stable, very, in some ways, traditional family from, I think, Massachusetts and upper New England. My mother from the DC area and Baltimore, but like long-term sort of white settlers to the US.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Why did they adopt?
Um, my mother and father got married my mother was young. She was 21 and just graduated from college. And my father's just a couple of years older. And they tried and they couldn't. And I'm pretty sure it's from an injury. My mother lost an ovary when she was young. She ovary burst when she was young.
Oh, wow.
That's a story she tells me. I always wonder. But like, not that I want to think anything darker happened, but she tried and they couldn't conceive. And my father at the time, and this was in the 60s, decided that, and they both decided, as much as they tried, that, they would go for adoption, but that also in terms of fertility at the time was kind of hard to, they weren't harvesting eggs and all that. But he, being the kind of person he was like, I don't want us to try to see, I don't want you to feel bad or me to feel bad if it's one of us that can't do this. So, we'll keep trying, but we'll adopt. So that's how that came to be. So they were, let's see, about 8 years later, or 6 years later, they adopted my brother, and he's 2 years older than me. And then they adopted me.
Okay. So it was two of you.
Yeah.
And how did you get along with your brother growing up?
I got along with him well when I was growing up, but we couldn't be more opposite, personality wise, looks wise. My brother is blonde and blue eyed and tall and skinny, and I'm 5 and, dark haired and dark eyed. And not that that's important, because that kind of thing can happen, in any family, but, we were just very different personalities. My brother was super intelligent, and almost to the point of like not very social because of that, had issues, maybe somewhere on the spectrum, of social issues, but just extraordinarily intelligent. We got along well though when we were young. We really did.
And growing up, did you have any fantasies about your biological family, or did you think about it much?
All the time. I always knew and felt very different. It's not like I could look in the mirror and see how different, but I would always fantasize about my birth mother. And they told me that she liked music and that she was seeking a career in music. The weird things social workers tell you, and I don't think that's true. So I would always imagine, I was always like just having, just thinking about her in very kind ways, and imagining like maybe she's a musician. My parents, knowing that little fact that she loved music, got me a piano when I was very young and got me piano lessons, and that was a big part of who I was when I was young. Playing the piano and taking lessons and really loving that. But like, I think I really went all out in imagining this woman who, probably went on to have a life and thought about me and was very creative. And I hoped to meet her someday,
Yeah. How did that end up affecting you when you found that out? You said that you kind of went into a depression?
Yeah. I think it was the culmination of many things in my life, just all coming to a head. And when I found out about her trauma, and her life, and my status as sort of the youngest of of 4 children on both sides, mother and father, and that she had been so badly, her childhood had been the way it was, and the circumstances of being 14 and pregnant and unmarried, it just freaked me out. It made me very, but it also put so much into perspective for me, in
Right.
things I had thought, because on the dark side, I have nightmares since the time I was 5, recurring nightmares that I can remember. And I always used to think, like, where does this come from? Why am I dreaming about dusty, deserty places with orphans standing around and wanting so badly to go hug these children and love them, and at a young age?
Wow.
Because and then I would have stories all the time of war and the end of the world, and being in the streets and trying to escape and get away and going down dark places. I've had those recurring dreams in different ways, like for many, like 30, 40 years. And I think that it is that identity crisis, that like that your DNA, you can't help, that stuff is in your DNA. That's who you are, just like how to breathe when you come out of the womb, and how to drink milk and everything else that you do as a child. It's ingrained inside of me, that survivor. My mother said that my first words weren't mother or father, they were by self, whether that's true or that's just sort of a way to describe my personality. I felt alone a lot. I felt I had to do things myself. I felt isolated when I was young, and I would be upset about something and my parents would go off and, they had each other, but I would just sit in my room and cry. Like, what is wrong with me? Why do I feel so alienated? Why don't they understand?
Yeah. Yeah. And what you were just saying about the nightmares and stuff, that's interesting, because that's kind of like that generational trauma that you hear about. I mean, you didn't go through those things, but it's like in your DNA. And that's interesting that it was coming out in dreams, and then finding out that kind of was all true for your mother, your biological mother. That's nuts. So what about your father's side, like the siblings over there? Have you met them, or?
No, and I don't, and it's very hard to connect with that side for many reasons. I think one, because of who I was to any of them, and he's been dead for so long. I mean, he's been dead for 58, 59 years. 59 years, yes. He was 50 when I was born. My mother was 25, and he wasn't a US citizen, and the people that his family, the relatives on that side are, I mean, it is a very, let's say, colorful family and situation. So these two twin brothers that I have, who are 11 years older than me, I think that they were only 11 when their father died, and they weren't with him, their mother had died. I don't know where they ended up. I don't think they had an easy life. Plus, I think that family thought of my birth mother as, sort of an interloper, and as, the woman that my birth father was with after their beloved, daughter had died. So I think I would be seen, not that it's my fault or I feel guilty about it, but as a scandal, or people didn't know about me. People didn't know that I was born. I'm sure my brothers did not know I was born. But I have not been able to find anybody on that side, although I'm working on it, because I have found some relatives on that side who are extremely helpful, who are in the UK. And then one that's here in the US, who are trying to help me. So, which is really awesome. Just to find out if anybody knows about him, because we know his name and there's just not much info out there.
So you did 23andMe. Did you do Ancestry too, or just the one? You did both?
Both. And it was extraordinarily frustrating in the beginning, because I was always searching for chauffeurs to the Greek ambassador, or chauffeurs in DC in the 1960s. And before 23andMe and Ancestry, just before, I'd come across one and his obituary. And I thought, oh my gosh, this man, and here's his name. So I went and I found out who his son was. And I didn't call him, but, because I didn't know yet, it's like, I'm not sure, like that seems right. And the time is right. But he actually was the chauffeur after my father died. But I went down this whole rabbit hole there.
Wow.
Yeah. But prior to that, like everybody, and that wasn't even somebody I was connecting with, every name was some Turkish or Greek name, nobody, and I just was like, and they were all second or third cousins. And it just seemed like, man, this is just never gonna, I was thinking, my mother's never going to do this, I'm never going to find out. I didn't think I would ever find out.
Yeah, I still haven't, even though I've, met my biological family, my siblings. I don't have any close matches. I've just done Ancestry, and they're all like second, third cousins, or way out there.
Mhm.
But it's still, I'm like, you still want that confirming, DNA, like a closer match. But with all those, I just still feel like I was never born. Like I still feel like I was never born. And I did have a genealogist, connect, because there was questions about my birth father, if it, he was really my father. And she found out that, he indeed was. And so that was good. But you're just still looking for that. I need to do 23andMe and see if I can find any closer matches.
It's very, I'm sure, when I found out, like from my brother, just, when we matched, after I had matched with my nephew, I just, it's like disbelief almost. It's like, how can this be, and who
Did he
am
show
I?
up as a cousin, or how did they put that on there?
Brother.
A
He showed,
half?
he did. He showed up as a half brother. So, and since I had just read, and plus by the, he said when he was, it said when he was born. So I'm like, oh, okay. I know exactly who this is. Like, there was no question, also because of who he was related to, because he was related to my nephew too. So I knew it was on my mother's side. You become when you use 23andMe and Ancestry, you become like a little private detective, like putting all these pieces together, the father's side, the mother's side, before you know any names.
Yeah. Yeah.
Washington, D.C. is extraordinarily difficult to get your birth records.
Mhm.
So I have not yet actually seen my original birth certificate.
Wow. That's so crazy. Did you see any mirroring in any of your relatives, like any resemblances or?
It's so hard. My sister, who just I actually saw a couple weeks ago, she came to see me. No, I mean, not a lot. Maybe skin color and coloring. But, you know, and my mother, I've seen pictures of my mother when she was younger, and I think there's resemblance. But even when my mother saw pictures of me, she said I looked like my father's side of the family. Like, they are tiny. They're like, I'm giant. I'm 5'5", and I'm giant compared to my
Mm-hmm.
sister, and my mother and my other sister.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so a little bit, but not a lot. And even my son said that. It's like, but when you're looking also at an 86-year-old woman, it's kind of hard.
Right. Yeah. So are you in contact with, who are you in contact with still then? Just the siblings on your maternal side?
Yes. Yes. And their children, a couple of them too. And this is all, I haven't met anyone other than my birth sister in person. My son has met both birth sisters and my niece and her children in Greece and my mother, but the only person I've met is my sister.
Hmm.
And it's a good,
So yeah, go ahead. What'd you
I
say?
was just going to say, it's a good relationship.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So did you consider yourself being in the fog and then kind of coming out when you found your birth mother and some of the siblings and stuff? Was that when the fog started lifting?
It's interesting having just heard the terminology, the fog, and all of the terminology is, I think that I see myself as being in a fantasy world prior about it, and then in a deep, what I call it, I think the fog started more in terms of reconciling it when I found out. The crash was pretty hard. I just couldn't get back up again. I needed real help in figuring it out. And my mother was like, anything I can do to help you, but she couldn't understand. It was hard for her to understand how I felt. I just felt like I was having an identity crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny that your adoptive mom kind of got protective of you, about how your birth mother reacted and how she was with you. Because my adopted mom, the same way. She was just like, I don't understand this. Why is she being like that to you? And she's
Yeah.
missing out. And, she just could not understand.
Yes. And, on the same side of that, my mother and I, it's not always been easy. My mother's just such a grounded, rational person. And it's not like I think I'm irrational, but I'm much more emotional, than my mother. And I think, her side of the story is like, she wanted me to be her child. I was her child. Period. The end. She didn't want anyone to look at me in the stroller and think that I wasn't her baby. In her mind, I'm her baby. And it's very hard for her to understand how I would feel anyway otherwise, and it's not that I don't, she's my mother, but I also recognize the differences of us.
Yeah.
Which are
The adoptive parents are in their own fog, and that's, what society has built adoption up to be all this time. And, everybody's bought into it. And, I think they're in their own fog and, starting to come out too.
And when you say that about what everybody's bought into, one of the really hard conversations we had recently is like, Mom, it's not like, so like birth families, you were told this whole story, and you're supposed to just get on board with it. Like this was the best thing for me. And, my poor mother, and she's like, she was getting really up. She's like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear bad stories. So that's such a good way to say that. She's in a fog of just, I don't want to hear bad stories about adoptees. I don't want to hear anything bad. I just,
Yeah.
it was all,
Yeah. And, it's no parent's perfect, but there was really nothing they can do to help us with that primal wound. They can do everything right, and we're still going to have that. It's not anything that they didn't do or they lacked doing or, anything like that. But it's hard to get them to realize that. A lot of adoptive parents take it personally that we're suffering, and they just don't want us to suffer. They panic.
yeah.
you know
I feel that. I also, though, struggled a lot in my adolescence, and my mother and father made me go see a therapist, which made me very resentful. And it wasn't good at the time. It was like the first one was like, here, look at Rorschach cards and tell me what you see. And, I just stare at the clock, waiting for it to be over with. I didn't have anything to say. I was just sort of an angry adolescent, I was 13, and then sent me to another one, and he was just a train wreck. Tried therapy on me, but kind of made me go to therapy. It's like, if you don't start behaving, you're going to have to go to therapy. And if therapy doesn't work, we're going to send you away to school. So there was just some tough times.
Yeah.
So something's wrong with you.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
I don't know what it is. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I just felt like it made me feel really bad about myself,
Yeah, I could see that. Oh my gosh. Do you think you're healing from the primal wound, or that we can't even heal from the primal wound?
I think that through some recent therapy that I've had that has been transformational, that yes, I can heal from that. I definitely know that I can't go back and change those moments of being born and then being separated from the first parents. And I know they hurt me, because my mother's even told, and father have told me how hurt I was as a new when they got me. But also I feel it. I can't describe it, but I'm sure other adoptees feel it too. Like you just feel this sadness around your birthday, number one, and then just some incredible, I think my biggest emotional issue is abandonment. I'll do anything to save a relationship. I'll stay in a bad relationship with a friend to keep that friend. I'll do anything to keep a relationship.
Yeah.
I can't stand to not be in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship, with
Yeah.
somebody, and I'm just talking about any, like that fear of somebody not, of leaving me has always been like probably 10 times stronger than most people I know,
Right. Yeah. Same here too. So what did it did help you? You said the therapy's been helping you. What's helped you?
helping me in realizing that I can change the reel that's been going on in my life for so long of sort of feeling bad about myself and feeling like I had something to do with, like, not first of all being wanted by my mother, or just that these are stories that I have fed myself for so long about, self-doubt, but I can get rid of those by realizing the accomplishments that I do have. Of course I have many things to be thankful for and grateful for, but and just realizing my own self-worth in my identity, and taking those things in my identity from the birth family, and being very proud of them from the standpoint of surviving,
Yeah.
what I was given by my mother, not just
Right.
life, but just the fact that if it weren't for President Kennedy, I would have been born in Turkey. And
And
how
then
that,
what?
yeah, I don't even, it's hard to think that way. It's just like when people say to me, this is always, that thing that people say because they don't know what to think about adopted people, like, how can you be, and I don't mean to get political, but how can you be pro-choice? I'm like, if there had been abortion, you might not have been born. I'm like, that's just the dumbest thing anyone could ever say to an adopted person.
Yeah.
Why would I be against abortion? Has nothing to do with me,
Yeah.
so, I just, I'm very grateful, but then again, I've got a lot of trauma, I think, around it.
So what therapy are you doing?
I'm doing somatic guided
Ah.
therapy, and
Okay.
mind blowing,
Yeah.
absolutely mind blowing. And I found
Awesome.
it through you, actually.
Okay.
Right. I mean, through the podcasts with Regina.
Okay. Yeah. Me and Regina are doing some things coming up here.
They it it I I didn't even think I could get there, and I got there, and I will continue to go there because I think that if you're not able to get in there and look at what's going on in your subconscious, it's really hard to clean it out a little bit and to get some more positive reels spinning in there that are going to get you, or actually get off the reel and start moving forward in terms of
Yeah.
acceptance.
What I found being a client was that I got things cleared out quicker than I would have doing like talk therapy or any other kind of therapy. Like it's accelerated and it's more gentle, and I don't know, and I'm still, things that I asked for my intentions 6 months ago, I think back and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can see that those things are coming to fruition now, and I totally forgot about them. But I've had some crazy journeys where I don't know if you have, but like I went back in the womb a couple of times in my journeys, and very interesting, and just it it made me have so much compassion for my birth mother because I could feel her emotions and all her adrenaline, and just I could hear her crying. And I was, I went through being born, and I mean, it was on and on and on. I could go on about the story, but it gave me peace. It
Wow.
gave me some peace and so much compassion for birth mothers. And it's kind of unexplainable. I don't, how SMGI works, because what happens in the inner world really does affect the outer world. Don't know how it happens. It's like magic, but it sure does. I'm
I,
so
I
glad it's helping you.
Yes, I will continue it because I would love to get that deep. I feel like that the primal wound and just even having those words to explain it makes so much sense, in trying to deal with it by either having compassion or just realizing that, like, for some reason I deeply feel the love of those foster parents, and I have been infatuated my entire life with Asian culture. I married a Korean man, part Korean man. I have Japanese art on my wall. I have always just had some sort of affinity or loved to look into the eyes of Asian
Mm,
people. And maybe that's because those were the first eyes that I looked into, really
yeah.
that loved me. And I feel that love and I feel their sadness, from
Yeah.
when they had to relinquish me.
Yeah.
If I feel that it must be real, I
Yeah.
just really believe that if I feel that it must be real.
Yeah. Too bad you can't figure out who they were
Yeah.
or, anything about them. That's just crazy. Like somebody had us and
Yeah.
strangers, really strangers, and they cared for us and fed us and nurtured us. And we have no clue who they are, where they are, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So, in closing, what would you like struggling adoptees to know?
I think that everyone's story is fascinating. And no matter how you come to it and how that you you feel today, that you need to be seen as your own authentic self, whoever you are, wherever you are in your journey, and to be accepted. And there is a community of people who understand and who
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. It's never too late to find yourself. Never
No,
too late to start over.
we're all searching in some ways to find ourselves in the continual quest. And I think that's one thing that has really opened me up to be able to share my story to other adoptees is, no matter what the circumstances, you can do this and you can get through it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today and telling your story, being brave.
I appreciate it.
I have had the most amazing guests on recently, and I just feel like I've gained like 5 best friends in the last 2 months. And I definitely feel that way about Elizabeth. There's just this vibe. Even when I just get their headshots, it's just like, I am really going to connect with this person. I'm really going to connect to their story. And I've had that so much lately. It's been so incredible. I love doing this podcast. And I love that these stories that I am bringing you through these guests are not only educating the world, but they are giving so much hope to other adoptees that are listening. And just hearing that she heard about somatic mindful guided imagery on the podcast and that modality is helping her so much with her adoption trauma is just amazing. And this is what I have experienced and what my clients have experienced as well. It's pretty amazing. And if you want to know more, go to my website, somatichealingjourneys.com, for more information. Don't forget, I'm giving away 3 free SMGI sessions. If you want to know more about how to enter, you can also find that on my website as well. The links are in the show notes. Last but not least, I am still looking for guests for the podcast. If you are interested, you can email me at mindyourownkarma@gmail.com, or you can become part of the Karma Crew on my website, mindyourownkarma.com. I can't thank you enough for listening today. And as always, take what you need and leave what you don't. And always remember to mind your own karma. I'll see you next time.